Actually, this is my 40th year in the classroom, and so I've been teaching for a very long time. Examination of how did we lose sight of the realness of God in people's lives? How do we as historians, anthropologists, and so forth, talk about the realness of God in history, culture, personal experience? There are those moments where you feel the power of their experience in what they're saying. I hear so many stories of people who go to shrines and who have some experience of being welcomed, as it were, by the shrine. Well, early Christian communities talked about the special love that they wanted to exist among members of the community. It was a kind of love that circled, that God was part of. You can see the power of these experiences. I mean, you could call them imaginary or illusory, but you have to acknowledge the power of these experiences in history and in culture. But those materialistic explanations have always seemed to me to miss the point completely. It's like talking about music by analyzing, to just say, well, this is an illusion, or well, this is just a brain wave. It just doesn't do any justice to the richness of the experience in history, time, place. I wanted to look at how do actual Muslims in different times and places live their faith. And I want to do that without judgment. I want to say there are many different ways of being Muslim. People may lose their faith, they may come back. Their faith may become weak, it may be strengthened. You hear people say, well, this tragedy destroyed my faith. Other people, this tragedy made my faith stronger. Jesus came to me last night in my heart. That person is not saying a symbol of Jesus came to me in my heart. That person is saying Jesus came to me in my heart. And it's different than to say a symbol came to me in my heart. I would want to talk about the Sheikh's spiritual presence. I mean, you say there's a connection, it's a continuation of the presence of the saints and the prophets. So that's a very powerful form of presence. And
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في سلسلة حوارات فكرية ومعرفية على قناة حيرة. In this interview, we are interviewing Professor Robert Orsi from the United States, who is talking to us from Chicago. Professor Robert Orsi is a professor of religion studies, history, and American studies in Northwestern University. He's a specialist in American Catholicism and writes books on theory and method for the study of religion. He's a former president of the American Academy of Religion. One of his important books is History and Presence, which we'll talk about its main ideas in this talk. So welcome, Professor. It's an honor having you with us today.
It's a real pleasure and an honor for me to be here with you.
So in the beginning, and just like I ask most of my guests, tell us more about yourself, your academic and spiritual journey in life, maybe the most important stations or people who influenced your life, why you chose this path of this field of religion and spirituality, and maybe you'd like to share a certain religious experience you've gone through. Yeah.
Well, those are really big questions. In the United States, where in the study of religion in secular universities, people try to make a distinction between their personal lives and their scholarship very often. As you know, I don't. I often include my own experiences and certainly my family's experiences in my books and my academic analysis. But the question you ask is often seen as a very threatening question in this world. So let me just say that I'm going to work my way towards it now. So I was born in New York City to a very Catholic, very devout Catholic, Italian Catholic family. So my roots in Catholic devotional practice, in the practices of piety and worship, go very, very deep from when I was a child. And I know that in very fundamental ways that shaped me and formed me. So then I went to Catholic schools until college. In college, I began to, as many people then in those days were doing, I did not go to many Catholic students were not going to Catholic schools. They were choosing otherwise. I went to a secular school. And then I went for my graduate work, my PhD, to Yale University. But in between my undergraduate work and my graduate work, you'll be interested to know, and this is very important, that I spent a year studying Christian monasticism. I spent a year actually living in Christian monasteries in Europe, and one monastery in Jerusalem, because I was very curious about the lives that monks lived. You know, what did it mean to be what did it mean to be a monk, to live one's life oriented towards God all day long? Now, you know, I'm not a romantic. I have a, especially at my age, I have a robust understanding of human ways. So I know monks aren't saints, but nonetheless, they have put themselves in a situation where on a regular basis all day they pray. And they certainly live in an atmosphere of prayer. And I was curious about that. What did this mean, to live in this atmosphere of prayer? So then I came back and I did my graduate work and I began teaching, raised a family, and here I am. I'm still teaching. Actually, this is my 40th year in the classroom. And so I've been teaching for a very long time. And I think, you know, why do people get into religious studies? I can't speak for everybody, but for myself, I've often thought that, you know, I looked out at my family when I was a child and I saw the richness of their experience and sometimes the difficulties of their experience. And one thing I noticed, I think, is that when they were in pain or in trouble of some sort or in need of some sort, they tended to bring this pain and need to God. And for them, it was a great source of hope and consolation. And I thought, well, I want to know more about this dynamic. I want to know more about this world in which this happens. And so I began studying it. And that's how I got here.
And talking about monks, so you didn't decide to continue as a monk, rather changing the path towards academic studies?
No, I decided very early in life that I was not cut out to be a monk, but I'm curious about them and I'm interested in them.
So
that's a great question.
So living for a whole year among monks, so do you believe, or given your experience now for more than 40 years, so do you feel or believe that monks live very special spiritual experiences in relation towards God and enlightenment? Or no, even ordinary people, even farmers or such pure people are everywhere, so saints can be found everywhere, and being a monk or taking a place where you are only dedicated to God doesn't give you a value added necessarily?
Well, that's a great question. And I suspect that comes out of your own reflections about life and about religion. No, obviously, holiness and relationships to God can exist, as you say, farmers, shopkeepers, mothers, housewives, husbands, all of those can be pathways to God. Absolutely. I believe that. And I mean, I think after my year in the monastery, I saw that monks are human beings like all other human beings. You know, they have this, they make the same errors, they have the same faults as anybody else, and they have to struggle with their inner worlds as much as anybody else. Now, it is true that they have a very rich language for talking about prayer and talking about their relationship with God. But you know, ordinary people acquire that language too in religious communities and in churches, mosques, temples. They also acquire that language. So no, I don't believe in the specialness of monks.
And in the philosophy of monarchy or being a monk, so maybe some people or some spiritual paths or some mystical schools will say that a part of your life or a part of your day or a part of your year, it's good to be isolated in a certain place
Yes.
to get some purity. But then if you want to develop and improve spiritually and see God, you have to encounter him in different manifestations, and then you'll ascend more towards him, because when you're in the middle of the challenges and problems, there your heart will be challenged. It's different than only practicing religion and prayers. Okay, it's a very great thing, and you can have a certain experience there, but you lose other experiences which only happens when interacting with daily life situations. So this could be
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Well, the great reformer of Christian history, Martin Luther, in the 16th century, that is one of the things he said. So at the origins of the Protestant Reformation, Luther rejected monasticism, although he himself was a monk, and he affirmed the holiness or the rich vocation of the householder, the farmer, the carpenter, and said that absolutely God is encountered in those places too. So that was a very Lutheran point you were making. I found that the monks that I lived with, in a way, in an interesting way, I like your idea about for some period of time. I mean, I thought that one of the great things about these monasteries, these small places where people go to pray, is that laymen like me, ordinary men who don't make that choice, can go for a week, 2 weeks, can be back in that atmosphere, can get redirected, if you will, and then go back to ordinary life and bring that back out into ordinary life. Absolutely.
Even the issue of marriage, although in Islamic Sufism, we have some saints who didn't marry their whole life. And marriage in Islam is one of the most things that a person should do religiously. But then, different than that, we say that certain manifestations of God can't be witnessed only through marriage, creating the family and feeling the mercy of being a father or a mother or a brother or a sister. And then because you have to love God and love other people. So even if you want to dedicate yourself towards God, you should live in a family, and also different kinds of excitement and joy you get through your marriage is also the signs of God even.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm married, and I can tell I'm happily married, and marriage is a challenge and a blessing and a beautiful thing and a hard thing. And you're absolutely right. Raising children has its own challenges and its own responsibilities. And I completely agree with you. But it's impossible. Let's just establish this as a ground rule for today's conversation. It is not possible to talk about a single Christianity, okay? Christianity is a very large and complex and multifarious universe of possibilities, just the way Islam is and Judaism and Hinduism are. We have to be careful not to essentialize Christianity. So there are many Christians who think that the monastic life is horrible. Oh my God, they wouldn't lead that. They think it's unnatural and so forth. Others who say, oh, this is the holiest way of living. I prefer as a scholar to step back and say, as you're doing, say, look at all these different ways there are of being in the world.
So different paths towards God. We have a Sufi saying which says the paths towards God are as many as human breaths.
Yes, I think that notion of diversity, of diverse paths, is very powerful. And the people who take those journeys are also all very different. They bring different things with them on the journeys. Different needs, different stories, different histories, and that's what we try to study. We in religious studies, we study the lives of people on those journeys.
So, Doctor, let us dig more and start talking about your book, which is a very interesting book, History and Presence. So, if you'd summarize the main idea or the main focus of your book, the main idea that you're trying to talk about in this book, and what do you mean by real presence? Are you talking about the presence of God?
So that book was really an attempt to say something about the way the study of religion has developed in Western modernity. So in the study of religion, I think it's fair to say that we talk about God or the saints and so forth as symbols, as functions of social life, but when I was a boy, I was taught as a Catholic that God and the saints are actually really present to us in our everyday world. They are there. They are part of the fabric of our everyday lives. They are involved in our family world. And so that book is both a challenge to scholars of religion. It's a historical examination of how did we lose sight of the realness of God in people's lives. And then a challenge, really, to think about how we can study the realness of God in people's lives. How does God make a difference in people's lives? And how can we as scholars of religion talk about that? When I say God now, I'm using God as a word to include all kinds of special beings like saints or angels or bodhisattvas or all the special beings of religious traditions. If we don't look at them, I mean, here, I have a statue. I mean, I could show you an image. I mean, so,
Sure.
Catholics believe that the image is not just a piece of plastic or wood, but that in some way, I mean, they're not stupid about this, in some way, the saint is present there. So that's very important. So I wanted to talk about, what do we do then? What do we do? How do we as historians, anthropologists, and so forth, talk about the realness of God in history, culture, personal experience? How does it matter?
It would be great if you share the image with us and explain.
Well, I'm trying to find one that actually matters here. Hang on. They all matter, but so this is an image of Saint Anthony. Now, many religions disapprove of images. I know Islam is one of them. Other religions have images of different sorts. Hinduism has many images. So what is this image? So this
Even
is
in Islam, there are different theories and ideas. Just you mentioned, there is no given Christianity. There is all different ideas. So even in Islam, especially the Sufi and the mystical view, they talk about sacred art and sacred music.
They do, yes. Okay. So, and that's what I mean by you can't talk in a single voice about these complex religious worlds. So this figure is Saint Anthony. He was very important to my family. He's a historical figure, an Italian saint. He had a vision of holding the baby Jesus in his arm. So when my mother put this image up in our house, she knew that this wasn't Saint Anthony, that Saint Anthony could be many different places, that she didn't have Saint Anthony, but she also believed that Saint Anthony, when she spoke to their statue or touched this statue, that Saint Anthony was present to her in a special way in the statue. So that's what I was trying to capture in that book. So if you think about people's homes, and I have a theory, Hadi, I have a theory that in everybody's home, whether they're religious or not, there is a shrine of some sort. There is a place where they put images of their loved ones. Maybe they put images of holy figures. They'll put a plant. And that is a special place in their house. Maybe when they're feeling sad or they're feeling thoughtful, they want to go to that place. So I wanted to know, what is it like to live with these presences all around us?
This opens the door widely to talk about sacred music and sacred art and the existence of sacred in such materialistic things.
It's a brilliant question. It's a brilliant question. And I didn't because I am one man and I can only work on one thing, but you're absolutely right. And I think that's a very powerful line of thinking. That presence is there in sacred music and sacred art I did talk about, but not sacred music.
Would you elaborate more in explaining how the sacredness can be manifested in arts or in musics or in shapes, given that there are different cultures and societies in the world, and each society connects to different shapes and arts, and this is an intermediary towards their existential need, for example, or...
Well, I wonder sometimes, there is a theory in cognitive science that religion is somehow hardwired in our brains. And it builds on other rational capacities and other cognitive capacities, rather. It builds on other cognitive capacities. And we are drawn to these presences. We are drawn to see them. We are drawn to encounter them. So I believe that, yes, in all cultures, there are opportunities to encounter these presences. And what forms that takes depends on the different cultures.
You reminded me of Mircea Eliade, where he believed that faith is an existential need which is rooted in the nature of every human being. In Islam, we call this al-fitra, which is the deep innate feeling in every person. And then he said that this need can be, we can see it throughout the history and so throughout different manifestations of people's cultures and societies.
Yeah, that is one theory of religion that's very powerful. Absolutely. There are others, but that is one theory of religion that's very powerful. And in part, one of the things I was trying to get at is that I was always struck, people in this part of the world and lots of parts of the world will often talk about religion as an interior matter, religion as interior. But this image is not interior to me, it's exterior to me. And I encounter this image as something outside myself. And that's part of what I wanted to get at in History and Presence. I wanted to get at that feeling that you are meeting something outside of yourself. I'm sure you've had people who have had a religious experience of a presence, like of a presence of God or a presence of a saint. And you say to them, well, that was a dream. And they say, no, it wasn't a dream. Well, you were imagining it. No, I was wide awake. I wasn't imagining it. This came to me. I was aware that this was outside of myself and it came to me. And that's the feeling I was very interested in. That feeling that it is outside of me and I am meeting it. It is coming to me and I am meeting it. Am I making sense?
So is this the importance of sacred places, for example, or shrines? I guess in the book also you mentioned things about shrines and their effects on human souls.
Absolutely. These are places where you go. Now, there are many shrines to St. Anthony, and people understand that you can meet St. Anthony anywhere. But it is also understood that you can meet St. Anthony in a special place at that shrine. And that's what shrines are. I think the scholar Jonathan Z. Smith, I don't know if you've come across him, he says someplace that the shrines are places where humans and gods become transparent to each other, And I agree, these are special places where humans and gods meet each other in a special way.
So we have places and we have times also. I'm sure in the Christian tradition, there's certain sacred times where the mercy of God is more, the presence of God is more.
Well, a friend of mine just wrote a beautiful book on Salat, the daily prayer. And what she was really interested in was the movement back and forth through a woman's day between encountering God in Salat at different times during the day, and then going out and and living your life, going to the store, talking to your friends, making dinner. And she was fascinated by this movement between the sacred space and ordinary life. But in Salat, of course, as I don't need to tell you, God is encountered in a particular way.
Doctor, I noticed that you're interested too much in interviewing people and having talks with especially survivors or people who had NDEs, near-death experiences, or certain experiences. So what's the reason beyond that? So do you encounter or feel certain things when doing such interviews, or it's a certain experience when you encounter people who had these experiences?
You're asking such fabulous questions. Yes, it is. It is a certain experience. You feel traces of that experience as they're talking to you. You feel like the conversation is electrified in some way by their experience. And there might be moments in the conversation where you're talking about this and that, and you're coming in and out of a topic, but when they talk about something where you feel you can feel a presence at that moment as they're talking, and you're absolutely right about that. That's actually something that I tell my students, that when they do research this way, when they do research by talking and communicating with people like this, and they listen very attentively and actively to people, that there are those moments where you feel the power of their experience in what they're saying. Absolutely. That, by the way, yes, you feel that power very strong. Yes.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah. So you reminded me of a friend who encountered a certain deep spiritual experience when he had the crucifixion with the body of Jesus Christ in his room, and then in a certain witness, we call it in Arabic kashf or ilham, he saw his body instead of the body of the Christ. And then he said that that incident was only one time in his life. It was very holy, it was very emotional, and I can recall it whenever I remember it, and it drove me through more spiritual, ethical, moral, and virtuous life.
Yeah, that's a very interesting. I have another friend who's a scholar who's working on precisely those moments. Those are very, very interesting. It never happened again to your friend, right? No, yeah. But that moment, he remembers that moment. That moment stays with him and has an impact beyond the amount of time it was, which I think is really true.
Do you recall several examples or stories that you'd like to share in this context?
Okay, I've never told anybody this story, okay, except my wife and some very close friends. But there's something very trustworthy about you, Hadi. I hope I'm right about this. So I was once sitting down thinking, and I wasn't awake. I was awake, but I was sort of in a kind of, dreamy, a little bit of a dreamy state. No drugs, no alcohol, just sort of my mind was wandering. And I thought, I was thinking about Christ, and I thought, what do we call him? What do we call him? Do we call him Lord? Do we call him Savior? Do we call him brother? What do we call him? And I heard this voice that said, why are you so worried about what you call me? You don't need to call me. You don't need to call me anything. And I thought, well, what does that mean? I don't understand what that means. And then the voice said something really extraordinary that has stayed with me all the time. It said, why are you so worried about what you call me? The voice said, come into the immensity of me. Come into the largeness of me. Now, Hadi, that is not the kind of experience I've had ever before or since. But something very powerful took shape in that moment, and it has stayed with me. Come into the immensity of me. Why are you worried about these names? Why are you worried about this? Come into the immensity of me.
Great. You reminded me of a certain verse from the Quran where we say, "إن هي إلا أسماء سميتموها." All these names, it is invented or created from our limited conceptual abilities, where God is beyond that, or God is the full mercy, where someone should go there and encounter Him directly.
Right. Exactly. Encounter God directly, who's too large for these names. These names will fail. They fail.
Doctor, and here let us dig more in the theory of presence that you tried to build and shape in this book. And I'd like to be a student of you in this few minutes. So explain to us what's this presence and how to feel it in daily life, in all different examples. A person lives, he sleeps, he eats, he drinks, he lives between his family and friends, he goes to work, he plays, he does exercise. So what about presence? Because in normal religious minds, we feel that our religious obligations are done through prayer, or through going to the mosque or church, or through doing certain rituals or certain obligations which we are told. Okay, so this is the specific religious life. And then we have between parentheses, a secular life, or a different life, or a life that we can live, which we do all our different things. So you are talking about a presence. So it is a presence of the divine, of the sacredness in all our life, in all our time that we live. So if you elaborate on that, please.
Well, one of my favorite images, and this I started thinking about a long time ago, but one of my favorite images is when I was young. You still see these. You see these in many European cities and American cities. You'll see people driving around, people who are Catholics driving around with maybe rosaries hanging from the rear view mirror of the car, or maybe they'll have an image of the Virgin Mary on the dashboard of the car. And that really struck me, because here you have people going about their days, just driving in traffic, driving from school to work, to pick up their children and so forth. And they are in the car with them is this presence. So one of the things that presence does, by the way, is it troubles, if it doesn't actually dissolve, that neat distinction between sacred and profane. It really troubles that idea that, there's these special times and places, and only those special times and places. Yes, there are those special times and places. But one of the things about those places is that they tend to reach out. They tend to reach out beyond themselves. So you go to a shrine, and the whole shrine experience is going to the shrine is important. The shrine is already reaching out to you as you are heading towards the shrine. And I hear so many stories of people who go to shrines. This is a very common story, and who have some experience of being welcomed, as it were, by the shrine. Maybe they will get there and someone will come out and say, "Oh, good morning, come in." Something as simple as that. And they will feel that the shrine itself has welcomed them. And then the memories of the shrine last long after people leave. So it's not like these are places that are completely locked off from the rest of life. They open out into the other areas of life.
And then what about different details of life, like eating and playing and going to work and gathering with your friends? And
yeah, again, I'm very interested, and again, this is what that book invites people to think about. What does that mean if there are presences? Many religious traditions offer ways of encountering the dead. Okay, they offer ways of inviting the dead to be present to you. I was in Taiwan once, where I witnessed a ritual where this man was having some trouble in his life, and he felt that in some way it had to do with disruptions in the spirit of his father. And so these priests invited the father back. And, you didn't see the father, but there was a moment where there could be an exchange. So I'm interested in how this happens and what the effect of it is, right? So what's the effect? Because one of the theories of the book is that this is not just a symbol, that to live in relationship with these presences, whether they're presences in music or presences in, has an impact on your life, on how you live, on what kind of a citizen you are, on how you relate to others, how you love, and so forth. That these are consequential in everyday life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Maybe this is one of the secrets of the strong friendships that we find between people, or the people who connect in doing a certain academic work or an academic group, or the secret of love between the people who marry and so on.
Well, early Christian communities talked about the special love that they wanted to exist among members of the community. It was a kind of love that circled, that God was part of, but that also circled and embraced all the other members of the community. And that's not an unusual idea, correct? I mean, my hunch is that exists in Sufism as well, that there's a love that embraces everybody.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great. But here, Doctor, the counter argument, or some of the people would oppose that, isn't near-death experiences and certain spiritual encounters and all these stuff that you mentioned that Muslim or Christian or Hindu people face when they visit shrines. So they try to explain it materialistically, or they say it is illusions, or it is the unconscious mind, or it is exaggerations from people who are limited in their conceptual and linguistic abilities. So it is a kind of an illusion, or it can be explained through the systems of the brain nerve system and this stuff. So there is nothing very special or sacred about it. So how can we analyze this? And you can analyze it spiritually, religiously, anthropologically, from social point of view.
I tend to analyze it anthropologically and historically. I mean, I would simply say that you have to look at the impact of, you can see the power of these experiences. I mean, you could call them imaginary or illusory, but you have to acknowledge the power of these experiences in history and in culture. And, you're not going to make them go away by ridiculing them or diminishing them. And we need a rich set of tools for talking about, conceptual tools for talking about how people enter into these relationships, how they have consequences in people's lives, what they mean, and so forth. But those materialistic explanations have always seemed to me to miss the point completely. It's like talking about music by analyzing, I don't know, the score. It's not just the score, it's the score as it lives in a community of people who bring their lives to the score and who experience their lives through the score. And you're not going to get at it through the score.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
We have to look at the web of relationships. We have to look at people's histories. We have to look at what people bring to the saints. Then we can begin to understand. To just say, well, this is an illusion, or well, this is just a brain wave. It just doesn't do any justice to the richness of the experience in history, time, place.
Mm-hmm. Maybe here you talk about the idea of the lived religion. What do you mean by that?
Well, that was something I started talking about when I was many years ago when I was younger. And it gets back to an idea we had earlier in this conversation about the many different, you will hear someone say, well, Islam says, no Muslim. And you think, well, wait a minute. I know a Muslim who. So this was an idea to say I didn't want scholars to study only the normative version of religions or religious worlds. I didn't want them to just have, to look at Islamic theology, to look at the 5 pillars and to say, well, this is what Islam is, and this tells us everything we have to know about Islam. I wanted to look at how do actual Muslims in different times and places live their faith. And I want to do that without judgment. I want to say there are many different ways of being Muslim. And the only way we're going to know what Islam is by looking at how it is lived in different times and places. So people will say, well, no Catholic. I'll give you an example. So, for much of Catholic history, it was a teaching of the church that only Catholics would go to paradise, only Catholics would go to heaven. But if you asked an ordinary Catholic about this, and this ordinary Catholic had a Muslim friend, they would say, no, my friend is going to go to heaven too. No, it's not, no. So that's what I was interested in. I was interested in how the lived versions of these faiths what the lived versions of these faiths are. I don't care. I mean, I care, but it's not sufficient to talk only about the official teachings. How are the official teachings lived? No Muslim drinks alcohol, correct? No Muslim drinks wine. Is that correct?
No Muslim should drink wine, is correct.
Okay, all right. Well, so there you go. And so then you say, well, why is this Muslim drinking wine? And how does he or she understand it? Can we talk to him about this? What does this mean?
Yeah, always lived religions are different, are more complicated. You can find all the complexities, and you can find the real experience within the people who are living in societies. You can find things that can't be founded only in the doctrines or in the institutional religion, if you can say.
No, I've seen so many times, some professor who has learned Islam from books or Christianity from books will say, this is what, Hinduism is. All Hindus do X. And, invariably some kid in the class will raise his hand or her hand and say, and it's always the grandmother, they'll say, that's not what my grandmother did. So I began to think of this as lived religion as sort of grandmother's religion. Lived religion is how religion is lived in everyday life.
So, Doctor, after 40 years of studying, so you may talk in general, or even you may talk personally. Is the faith of a person strengthens when he becomes to know all these different experiences, and because there's something so much true that exists in different people's life? So a faith of a person improves and develops more. And if I'd ask you now to define your faith or your love towards God now and maybe 20 years ago or maybe 40 years ago, it would be different.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's it. I mean, as you can imagine, given my commitment both to the encounters with presences in everyday life and in lived religion, I would say that it changes as a person goes through life. I mean, you hear this all the time. A person is very religious at one point, and in many Protestant circles, and some Catholic circles, but in many Protestant circles, that is understood to be a problem, right? Faith is a once and for all thing. And I remember when I first became a scholar of religion, really struggling with that, because I know that, if you ask a person, tell me about your faith life, they'll tell you about particular moments, particular experiences, it'll be a different story as their lives move and change and shift. It's not one thing, faith, that's fixed forever in a moment. People may lose their faith. They may come back. Their faith may become weak. It may be strengthened. You hear people say, well, this tragedy destroyed my faith. Other people, this tragedy made my faith stronger. And it's impossible to generalize.
The first.
I think you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I think you have a real instinct for this. You know, you want to hear stories. You want to hear about experiences. You say, tell me stories. You don't say, tell me what you believe. You say, tell me what's happened to you. You know, tell me what you've done. What's happened to you and what have you done? And then we can start talking. And at the end of it, you'll have an idea of my faith.
Because a strong faith will show and will manifest and will influence the person's life, and it will enlighten him. And so knowing these stuff will enable a person to understand the faith of another person in a better way.
Yes, and you have to really, yes, I think that's right. Are you suggesting that a scholar of religion has to have some faith?
Sure. How can a person study religion if he doesn't have faith? Religion is not mathematics or physics or chemistry to study certain things and to be an outsider or to look at them. You can do that, but then you are you are an outsider study of religion. A real studier of religion is a religious person in a way or in another. And many people which I encountered, professors all from the world, especially the people who teach Sufism, they may not express or say that we are practicing or we believe in Sufism, but you find the smell and the taste of the virtues of the Sufi doctrines in their life, and their attitude, and their ethics, and their treating with other people.
Right. No, I agree with you. You have to, sometimes people talk about it as a kind of ear, like certain people can hear music, and you don't have to believe, but you have to have some sensitivity, I think. Even if you call it an existential openness to what people's lives are and why they are doing what they're doing. But if you think this is all crazy, you probably shouldn't study religion.
So the first time I knew about your book, History and Presence, when a friend of mine, he is a PhD student, he told me that the same idea that we study in Sufism and in mysticism in Islam and the theories of Ibn Arabi, which God's names and manifestations are present everywhere, in all details of life, in every breath that we breathe. And there is an author which is called Robert Orsi. He presented this idea in a very modern form, in a different context, in a different words and language, from the Catholic and from the Christian maybe theories, but he presented the same idea of Ibn Arabi in a very beautiful form.
Oh, well, I'm touched and honored by that. Let me tell you, Hadi, that I'm always a little uneasy when people say it's the same, because cultures are different. But I am absolutely happy to see resonances, or we could talk about comparisons. Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, there have been many Catholics and many Christians who have held this idea that God is one, that all pathways to God, there are many different pathways to God, but it all lead to the same God. There have been Catholics who have said that. So this is an idea that is one of the ideas available in Christian theology, absolutely.
Commonalities and similarities can be found more in the Sufi or in the spiritual dimensions of religions. Now I can find many studies that are done comparing between Ibn Arabi in the Sufi, in the Islamic Sufi tradition, and Meister Eckhart from the
yes. Yeah, I think there's a sense that, you know, we were talking earlier about monasticism, right? So the roots of the word monasticism are in the Greek word for alone, monos, alone. And the idea of the monk was to be alone with God, okay? Just this experience. And the experience is described in the 4th century of the Common Era by St. Augustine, who talks about being taken up into this experience of God. And it is true that there is this impulse towards transcendence. You see this impulse towards transcendence in many different religious worlds. Even my story about come into the immensity of me is that kind of story. And it could be a kind of yearning in the human heart and soul to go beyond the differences that divide us and that render us so different from each other, to find some place, some holy ground where we can stand together and say, here we are one. And I think that's a very powerful urge. I mean, as an anthropologist and a historian, I'm always paying attention to cultural difference and to culture, but I must acknowledge the power of that experience that we're both talking about.
Mm-hmm. Because each human has the same soul which he was gifted and given from God. And when he encounters a very pure or a very high spiritual experience, so there things are similar. Even though in language and culture and society he may express it in a different way. But then the real experience which is happening there, things there are more similar than here.
What would you call that experience, though? I mean, what's the name of that experience that you're calling the same experience?
So it's not same in a form of identical, just if we are in factories and the factory produces the identical stuff. Right. But it's same that it refers to a very high level of spirituality that is common to souls, because the same soul is given to different people. In Arabic, it has many names. So ilham, kashf, shuhud is witnessing or being enlightened, or there is something that comes inside your heart, or it's light inside your heart. So we have nur, which is light. We have ilham, we have kashf, we have shuhud, we have ifada, many different names.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, the Buddhists may call it enlightenment, Satori, yes.
Maybe you'd like to comment here?
What?
You'd like to comment here on what I said?
No, I hear you. I mean, I appreciate, I mean, we're struggling to name something. I mean, I tend to fall back on an existential account of this. What is this? I mean, if what is this human impulse that we're talking about? Does it come from our knowledge of our dying? Is it a yearning for something beyond the limitations of our experience? Is it, are we getting glimmers of this throughout our lives, some sense that the world is not, I mean, the number of people, whenever I talk, and maybe you have this experience too, if I talk about my book, let's say I get invited on a radio show to talk about my book. In no time at all, everybody, suddenly people are calling from all different religious traditions. They want to talk about their experiences. So obviously there's something built into the structure of human life as it is lived, that wants this move that you're talking about, this move to transcendence, to a deeper understanding, to something.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And this thing can be limited to theological doctrines or conceptual forms or ideas which religious institutions teach people. It's a very limited form of religion and spirituality there.
Which one?
Which is given in the institutional schools or religions, I mean.
Well, you know that Sufism is very, very popular now in the United States. And there are many people who are attracted to that message. And so I think what happens is that on the spiritual landscape, on the religious landscape, I mean, look at all the different religions have generated some form of mystical encounter and some form of and if we don't want to use the word mystical encounter, some form of a deep experience of the other. You know, you talk about Meister Eckhart. There were the pietists in Christianity. There have been mystics in Christianity, you know, all along. So And now I take very seriously the popularity of Sufism in the United States. There are people who really want something, from this world that Sufism has to offer them.
What's the reasons beyond that Sufism is growing or finding, or people are searching for it?
I don't know. I haven't studied it. I had a student who unfortunately left the program who was going to write her dissertation on it. There are these different Sufi communities and different brotherhoods in different places in the United States. I used to teach at Harvard. There's a major one in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and maybe you know about it. And I think there are Americans, just the way at different times Americans have searched other traditions. And there are many ways that there are many grounds on which we can dismiss this curiosity. We could call it Orientalism. We could say it's a form of Romanticism. But that's the kind of reductive move I would prefer that my own students not make. I remember standing in airports or in subway stations in the 1960s and 1970s watching Hare Krishna dancers. And, it was very common for people to make fun of these people. And I thought, okay, there's all kinds of reasons here, but something we need to look at this. We need to look at why these humans are doing this thing and finding it so powerful, reciting the name of God over and over and over and over again,
Great. So one of the things I was going through in your book is the relation between emotions and religion. So do you think that there is a great relation and connection between the human emotions and the topic or the reality of religion?
I think emotions are very important. I don't want the thing I would be very hesitant about. I think the body is very important in religion. It's not just the spirit or the soul. I think the body is very important also. I think that emotions are important, but religious people are also thinking people. They're also thinking. So they're not just feeling. I think there was an idea at one point that there's often the idea that we can talk about religion exclusively in terms of feeling, but a feeling. And then you think, what does this feeling mean? Or why did this happen? And then you link it to other feelings. But I think we need to talk about the range of feelings.
Dr. Now, I'll just mention some quotes of your book and then you can comment on or explain them. You say the term of religion, as the word is commonly used today, took shape at the same time that violent conflict over Christ's word at the Last Supper was tearing Europe apart, and religion is fully marked by the circumstances of its origin. Emergent understandings of religion in the 17th and 18th centuries would not only be free of presence, they would safeguard against it.
So that is a comment about the history of the word religion as it developed, in the modern era. So the academic or the modern study of religion dates to the 16th century in the West. And people were studying religion before this, people were talking about religion, but religion as we now talk about it, the tradition of religious analysis that leads to departments of religious studies in Western universities today has its origins in the 16th century at just a time that Protestants and Catholics were fighting over what took place during the liturgy, the sacrament.
Mm-hmm.
So Protestants understood, after Luther, Protestants understood the sacrament to be a memorial, a sign, a symbol, whereas Catholics, of course, and Lutherans understood it as a presence, a real presence. When I was a little kid, the nuns, my teachers told me that we should be we couldn't touch the host. We couldn't touch the host because that was God's actual body. That once the host was blessed by the priest, we could not touch it because it was God's body. That's different than saying that that's a symbol. So that split comes in the West in the 16th century.
Yeah, Doctor, so you begin your book by mentioning your mother's deep belief and love for Christ. So if you'd explain this and why you use this example to talk about your idea, and that you talk also about that the church problem with the real presence is controlling access to it.
Yes, well, real presence is dangerous, right? I mean, if I could bring this statue home, I could do anything I want with it. And that's dangerous. So I think over time in Catholicism, the church has tried to control these expressions of presence, but it always fails. And I think this is true in many religions. Elites try, if you look at Shinto or Japanese Buddhism, elites try to control access to the power. And that was my mother. I used my mother in part to give a sort of personal context for all of this, but also because she really believed. Her feeling was, and this is lived religion. This has nothing to do with Catholic theology, really. Excuse me. My mother really believed that if Catholics said that this host was actually God's body, then how could they prevent anybody from going to get access to God's body? And so, Catholics say if you're living sinfully, you should not receive God's body. And my mother's thought, and she wasn't a theologian, she was, an ordinary woman. My mother's thought was, it's precisely sinners you want to touch God's body. You want them to be near God's body. And that's a very dangerous idea. So I used her as an example of a very radical position in Catholicism.
What's the danger in that?
Well, the danger of it then is that the church no longer can control who has access to, they can't be the ones to say you don't have access.
Doctor, I also wanted to ask you, so what about the eating of or drinking the wine, eating the bread, and then the body of Jesus will be manifested in you? Or so is it a symbolism, or is it a deep existential theory, or it's how we can understand it?
It's not symbolism. That's the whole point. That's the divergence that takes place in the 16th and 17th centuries. Is it a symbol or is it real? And increasingly, I mean, the whole study of religion as an academic discipline is based on the understanding that it's a symbol. And what I've tried to do in that book is restore the concept of presence to the study of religion so that we can start talking about presence and not talking about symbols. When somebody says, Jesus came to me last night in my heart, that person is not saying a symbol of Jesus came to me in my heart. That person is saying Jesus came to me in my heart. And it's different than to say a symbol came to me in my heart. So I was trying to get back to before that divergence takes place, before the language of symbolism and representation and so forth, and to recapture something of the power of symbol. I'll give you another example, if I might, from my own experience, my own experience. So, after 1964, Catholics could once again drink from the cup, right? So the priest would bless the blood, the wine, bless the bread, excuse me, and that would turn into the body and blood of God and would be God's own blood. So there was a period of time where we were going to church in New York at a church that was near a hospital, where there were a lot of sick people around this church and people coughing, like I just coughed, people coughing and so forth. And I remember asking my mother once as she was going to take this big cup, and I remember everybody would line up and they would all drink. They would all start drinking from this cup. I asked my mother once, I said, aren't you afraid that, I mean, these people are coughing all around you? You know, this is, she said, oh, you're not going to get sick from God's blood. That's not a symbol anymore. Now, we may want to challenge her. We may want to note the danger of that. We may say that the germ theory of disease doesn't necessarily recognize Catholic theology. But as far as my mother was concerned, that was not a symbol.
See, but here we can differentiate between a certain spiritual experience that a person is encountering, where he sees or he feels that it is real, or it is actually real, and then performing a certain ritual which doesn't necessarily manifest such a spiritual experience when doing it.
What are you thinking about? Do you have an example in mind?
So it's two different things. So even prayer, I can do it as a ritual, which is free or empty of any holiness or spiritual involvement. Or maybe one of the days I'll have a very deep spiritual experience in this same prayer.
Yeah, although I'm not sure it has to be a big emotional experience, So like these women that my friend writes about in her book on Salat, they're not saying, oh my God, I had this big emotional experience. They just have a kind of quiet sense of God's being there. But I want to acknowledge your point here. Yes, there are many different kinds of religious rituals, and not all rituals involve presence. Absolutely.
So, Doctor, here you mentioned also the doctrine of the real presence of God's body. They had begun to distance themselves thoroughly from being able to conceptualize the divine in human form. Modern religion, both as the object of theoretical study, as the authoritative assertion of what religion itself is, arose within an intellectual and social environment shaped by the trajectory of these theological debates.
Yes. So I'm saying that those theological debates about whether God was really present or not in the host had an impact on the theorizing of religion 4 centuries later. And that's still present. At least, and so if you come into this university world, you will find that people do not talk about God's presence. How are we going to understand God's presence in history? They talk about the symbolization of God, or the image, the image of God, where I'm really talking about what happens when people say that God is actually present to them.
So they deal with it as an academic topic of study only.
They deal with it as a symbol, a function, an idea, as you were saying earlier, an illusion, a fantasy.
You also say here, Doctor, when I have talked about this project over the years in different contexts, colleagues and friends have challenged my emphasis on the presence of the gods. They inevitably remind me that absence is also a religious category. Presence necessarily entails absence, they say. God's absence is a powerful trope of Christian theology. Moreover, at once, both ancient and modern, I know this. Some of the most beautiful writing in the Christian tradition has to do with the silence of God, with God's hiddenness, and with the dark nights to which humans may come in their search for this God. Absence and presence in theory and theology are twinned.
Yes. Amen.
So what do you mean here? You're talking about absence also, or what does it mean?
Well, it's just that everybody wants to talk about absence all the time, whenever I try to talk about presence, they will always say, well, God is also absent, or God does, God may be fugitive, God may be unavailable. There are religious traditions in which God cannot be named, cannot be made present. Yes, I know all of that. But I'm interested in the religious traditions that say, here God is. In Sufism, what's the name of the leader of the group?
So you mean a sheikh? You mean Sheikh al-Tariqa?
Yeah. So what kind of authority does the sheikh have in terms of making God present or not present to the group?
A spiritual authority, due to his very high level of spirituality that he has. He has certain emotional states of spirituality that he reached to. So his holy presence is considered very respected or very holy for the people who are practicing, because they didn't reach to such level yet.
And certain things can be done, if I understand the Sufism, certain things can be done when the sheikh is present that cannot be done when the sheikh is not present. Is that correct?
So there are many details here, but yeah, you can say that. So certain type of rituals can't be done only with the presence of the sheikh. You can say that.
And is his presence understood to be somehow spiritually efficacious? In other words, it's not simply the presence of authority or the presence of leadership in secular terms, but it's the presence of a being who has a certain kind of spiritual power. Correct?
It's the last one. So it's a continuation of the presence of prophets and saints. So he is considered one of the saints. So if you found a real Sufi master, which nowadays maybe rarely exists, so he's considered a saint, and the saint has an open heart towards God. So the barakah, the grace of his prayers, of his du'as will be more when he's there. It's like the sacred places or times. It's something else that is added to that prayer or to that ritual.
And see, this is what I want to talk about. I want to talk about that presence. That to me is where, I would not want to talk about Sufism in terms of the leadership authority or the symbolic importance of the sheikh or the, I don't know, whatever. I would want to talk about the sheikh's spiritual presence. I mean, you say there's a connection, it's a continuation of the presence of the saints and the prophets. So that's a very powerful form of presence. And as you're saying, as I understand it, it is active in the world. The sheikh's presence is not just, oh, hi, I'm here now. The sheikh's presence makes things happen. Correct?
Sure.
Okay. Now we're talking about presence.
I think it's very similar with the Christian saints and holy people. And
I'm surprised when you say that. So you don't find there are no sheikhs now, or no?
No, in the very high, full spiritual level that we read in the books that were exist. So we're talking about Ibn Arabi, for example, or Rumi, so they existed until maybe 60 years ago. Nowadays you can find them, but very rarely, or maybe they're not so famous or something.
Okay, got it.
What about saints in Christian societies? Same?
Yeah, a little bit. They've also become rarer, and I think this has to do with modernization, don't you? I mean, modernity is not a comfortable place for these presences.
So in chapter 2, you mentioned a story when you stop near a gas station and a person talks about a Virgin Mary and her presence. So the image or the image of the presence of Virgin Mary is too much in the Christian tradition. So if you mention a story for us from your knowledge or something about her presence and the importance of that.
Well, in that case, it's an actual apparition, an appearance of the Virgin Mary in Knock, Ireland. where the Virgin Mary appears. I don't have the exact date in my head. It's in the book. But where the Virgin Mary appears, and people saw her and encountered her. And again, if you talk to those people, they don't say, well, I dreamt about the Virgin Mary, or I imagined the Virgin Mary was here. They say, I saw the Virgin Mary.
So in the book, when you talk about God, also when defining the term God in its Greek definition, and now also you differentiate between both?
Well, now I was just trying to use that word to encompass all different kinds of spirits. I didn't want to, each time I said it, I didn't want to have to say God, spirits, sheikhs, prophets, and so forth. But I wanted to talk about all the beings in the religious traditions who are understood to have a kind of other than worldly presence.
So Dr.
That gas station attendant said, because we were standing in the place where the Virgin Mary appeared, not the gas station, but we were standing in, although, you know, the Virgin Mary did appear in a gas station in Cairo after the Second World War, according to her devout. But his phrase that really captured my attention, his phrase was, here the transcendent broke into time. And it was that phenomenon that really captured me. And I wanted to think about, how could we think about this theoretically? This idea that here we have time, the ordinary structures of human time and place, into which something extraordinary breaks and changes the meaning of time and place. That's why I was asking you about the sheikh, because it seems to me that the sheikh can be said to break into time and space and change time and space.
And even he can go to places in the same time, so he can exist in the same time in two different places.
Right.
So Togder, it was very interesting talking about your book and the idea of presence and all these stories. But so if you'd like to summarize the whole idea, all these details that we mentioned now, and maybe in several minutes about the presence and the main ideas, just let us recap the ideas that you mentioned in
Well, to recap the ideas, we could keep using our example of the sheikh. I mean, anybody who tries to study Sufism without recognizing and acknowledging that to Sufis, the sheikh has an incredible power of presence, is not studying Sufism. They are studying a Western fantasy, a modern, because I'm sure there are Muslim scholars who say the same thing. They are studying a modern translation in their own minds of Sufism. Oh, Sufism is a wonderful spiritual this. You know, it's like the Dalai Lama. Everybody wants to say that the Dalai Lama, you know, he's a good guy. He understands climate change, all of which is true. But the Dalai Lama is also the reincarnation of the Buddha. And to his followers, he's that too. So that's it. We need to take presence on its own terms and then think about what it means historically, interpersonally. What happens in the room when the sheikh enters? What happens in that town when the Virgin Mary comes? What happens when God speaks?
So, Doctor, you mentioned several examples from Islam and Sufism and the Sheikh, and from Hinduism and the Eastern religions, and then all other examples of the Virgin Mary and the other encounters in the Christian tradition. So, what is your idea or thoughts about respecting other people and other religions and other forms of knowing God all among societies and histories? So,
Hadi, that's a very hard question, because when people live together and they inhabit these different worlds, it's very hard to know how can we live together. If your God says this and my God says this, how can we live together? I think that's really it's an ancient and contemporary problem for the human race.
So are they different gods, or they are different interpretations of God, or God manifested for different societies and different books and different prophets? Or
that question I cannot, that's a metaphysical question I can't answer.
But you don't think about, because the people who study the comparative religions, they try to find a certain transcendent unity of religion where things are similar, then there are differences there. So
that I don't do. No, no. I say if we're going to live together, we're going to have to live together in our diversity, not in our similarity.
But then one should respect the otherness and the differences and the diversity that exists there.
Yes, one should respect it and acknowledge it and know about it and learn about it. Yes.
Okay, Doctor.
I think if I was in Oman, even though we live in different religious worlds and we look different, I think you and I would be good friends because we know how to talk to each other, and that's what I mean. If we knew how to talk to each other, that would be good. I don't want to convert you. You don't want to convert me. We respect each other's worlds, but we can talk to each other.